I'm here today to talk about Stethoscope, which is Netflix's approach to securely configuring endpoint devices without systems management. This is work that I did while I worked at Netflix, along with the rest of the Stethoscope team. In particular, Jesse Chris and Rob McVeigh were responsible for a lot of the work that I'll be showing you guys today. So how many of you have been in this situation where your friends or family come and ask you for technical support? Show of hands. Yeah, pretty much everybody. And if you're like me, then when you're trying to fix their printer or whatever, you're also looking at their security settings on their machine and figuring out where can we do this better? Where can this machine be set up so that my friends, my family aren't victims of the latest malware or what have you? And so we set out to design Stethoscope with the goal of securely configuring endpoint devices. And there's a couple of ways to go about getting there. So one is manual intervention. You go to your friend's house and you sit there for a couple of hours and you configure it, or you sit down with them and you work through the configuration with them sitting side by side. But wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to do that? And in particular, this is not going to scale up to organizations of more than a couple people, right? This just doesn't work. So the usual answer from larger organizations is systems management, by which I mean software that controls systems and enforces predefined configuration settings. There's a lot of examples of these. Various vendors that will provide the software for you. Jamf, Landesk are two of the major ones. Microsoft through Active Directory does some of this. There's a bunch of others like Fleetsmith, AirWatch, any of these things. And there are some open source products that do similar things. You've probably seen Chef and Puppet used in this fashion, and there's similar tools that are more sort of server focused like Ansible and Salt. And you might be wondering, so what's wrong with this approach? And following on the heels of Kevin's talk, I don't trust systems management. And I think I have a bunch of good reasons for that. The major one is risk. So systems management tools, this is third-party software that's running on your machine with escalated privileges. A lot of times they have their own administrator account. They're installing kernel extensions. That's a lot of trust to place in this software. And I think if you really thought about it, if you took a step back and looked at it, if this wasn't ostensibly security software, would you allow this to be on your machine? A kernel extension that you don't necessarily trust? Probably not. And we've seen security software that actually does have vulnerabilities that can be exploited like this. A couple of years ago at DEF CON, there was a talk on Little Snitch, their kernel extension, and how there was a vulnerability there that could be exploited to do some really nasty things. A Little Snitch, if you're not familiar, is an outbound firewall for macOS. Secondly, another aspect of risk here is that you've now enabled remote access enterprise-wide. Most of these tools have some way of doing remote desktop or remote terminal access to every machine that they're on. And this turns out to actually be a big approach for doing lateral movement. Once an attacker has compromised a machine, usually they'll try to get to something like the Active Directory controller, and from there they can access, if you're using Active Directory, pretty much every machine in your fleet. And lastly, insecure defaults. So just because you have systems management software doesn't mean it's configured correctly to configure your devices correctly. You still need someone to actually define those policies and implement them within the tool and make sure that they're actually working and doing what you think they're doing. And in this case, we actually had a vendor instructed us to forcibly enable the SSH daemon on everyone's Mac laptop within our fleet. And not only that, but that's with default settings. So we're talking about password auth enabled on SSHD on every Mac laptop in the fleet. Not just engineers who probably have secure passwords, but everybody, including marketing, legal, everybody who works for Netflix. And that one right there, that was a couple of years ago, and I'm still really mad about that. And that's probably a major reason why I don't trust systems management tools. Another aspect of systems management that's a bit of a problem more for smaller organizations is the investment. So you need personnel, you need infrastructure, and you need licensing. This is your classic triad of, 3 things, pick 2. And for major organizations or companies, this probably isn't much of an issue, but for smaller organizations, a lot of times these licenses where they do most of the work for you come with like 50 device minimums or 100 device minimums, and at $5 to $10 per device per month, that adds up for small organizations, particularly nonprofits. Also, we tend to mistakenly think about large companies and organizations as sort of these homogeneous entities, and that's not true at all. Netflix is probably a particularly egregious example of this, but I think this is true of most major organizations, that you work in some capacity with a lot of different partners. For Netflix, most of this is on the production side of the company. Netflix is basically a major movie studio and TV studio. And Netflix works with hundreds of third parties to develop content for their shows. And these third parties can range in size from one individual to thousands of employees with thousands of devices. Excuse me. And these are often short-term contracts, particularly in the production space. You'll have a vendor that you bring on to do subs and dubs and that takes 3 months for one production, right? And you might never work with that vendor again, or you might, work with them on 10 productions over 10 years, but not, contiguously. And this kind of leads into the topic of bring your own device, which I think is a increasing theme within the community, particularly for individuals. So the idea that you can bring your phone or your laptop, and that becomes your work machine, right? But also for partners. So these are external companies that aren't part of Netflix, but they work with Netflix. And so their devices are owned by that external company. And yet, it's of paramount interest for Netflix to have those devices be secure. Can we install our systems management software, which is basically rootkitting those machines? Not really. So we needed to come up with a way to securely configure those devices without actually controlling everything. And what we came up with is something called the Stethoscope app. So it looks a little bit like this. It's a checklist, essentially, of simple high-value recommendations. So the defaults are things like, is the system up to date? Is the firewall enabled? Is disk encryption enabled? Is the screen lock enabled? Or automatic updates enabled? And particularly for Netflix, is remote login enabled? We don't want that, unless you really know what you're doing. So Stethoscope, the app, is read-only. It doesn't change anything for you. It just looks at your settings and tells you what's good and what's bad. It does not require administrator access. In the default mode, there's no infrastructure involved because it's a standalone app that you can just hand out to anybody, and it'll work. And so for that reason, it's safe for your friends and family. You can hand them this app, and it doesn't phone home. It doesn't talk to any other systems, so you can just hand it out as a standalone application. And one of the big tenets of Netflix is this idea of context and not control. And so we believe that giving people context, helping people understand the implications of their decisions, will lead them to make the right decision ultimately. And there's kind of 2 parts to this. So one is helping them understand why these changes are desirable, and the other is making it easy for them to do the right thing. So what we do is provide a little blurb that explains, hey, a firewall is important, here's why, here's what a firewall is, and here's why. And then we have step-by-step instructions that are customized for the current device, for that OS, for that version of that OS, that can walk you through basically enabling your firewall. In fact, if you click on these little highlighted links, it'll pop open the appropriate preference pane. For you, and then you can just click the button and make the change right there. And then we also have multi-part checks. So some of these, Apple makes it kind of needlessly complicated to enable automatic updates. It actually ends up being 5 separate options in most versions of macOS. So you can drill down and do multi-part checks like that. And it's open source. And it's built on some fantastic open source tools like Electron, which is the UI toolkit behind Slack, OS Query, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, which is what actually powers the configuration retrieval part of Stethoscope, and GraphQL, and I'll show you where GraphQL fits in just a minute. So you might be saying, you know, this looks good from a user's perspective, but what about organizations? So there are a few different approaches you can take to customize this for your organization. One is that you can build your own version of Stethoscope. It's open source. We provide the build tools. So all you need is a code signing certificate, and you can stamp it as built by your organization, so that when your employees download and install it, they see that it is signed by Netflix Inc. or whoever. You can customize the policies. So if you have a particular range of versions that you think is okay for Mac OS or whatever software is installed on the machine, you can customize what that range is. You can customize the different policies that you want enabled, that sort of thing. Further, we've tried to make it really easy to add additional practices. So this is what the remote login practice looks like. It's 2 lines of code, basically. Relying on OS Query to actually retrieve the preference value. And finally, at Netflix, we've integrated this Stethoscope app with our single sign-on system so that it's actually doing policy checks at auth time. The way this works is when a Netflix employee goes to access an internal web application at Netflix, they're redirected through our single sign-on flow. That flow, because it's on a whitelisted domain of netflix.com, can query the embedded GraphQL server in the Stethoscope application and retrieve the status of all these different practices. And that lets you do things like block access to sensitive apps. So if you have financial data stored somewhere and you don't want anyone accessing it without disk encryption enabled or automatic updates or whatever, you can do that. But it also lets you control the policy on a sort of sensitivity-based level. So if you are gating access to the lunch menu, you probably don't need disk encryption to look at the lunch menu. Excuse me. And so if you're using it like this, you can use it as sort of part of a zero trust strategy because you have this assurance of the device's security posture. And this is also where GraphQL comes in. We used it here because we want the server to be able to specify that it needs to look at these 5 settings and nothing else. And that way, the application running on the endpoint is not just dumping a whole list of all the information that it has about the endpoint. It's only returning exactly the information the server requested. For some of you, what I've been describing might be kind of familiar. We released as open source the Stethoscope web app a couple years ago. It was a talk we gave at ShmooCon in 2017. The major difference here is that the web app has a list of for each employee, all of their devices. But it has a couple of requirements that we weren't particularly happy with. One is that it needs an external data source. So you need something like a systems management tool or OS Query set up with all the infrastructure to collect the information externally in order to power the Stethoscope web app. And again, it requires infrastructure because you have to host the app somewhere, and it requires somebody who knows what they're doing to actually maintain the application. As we were developing and deploying the Stethoscope app, we ran into a bunch of interesting challenges. So some of these were technical challenges. macOS, for instance, likes to change the location of various settings between releases for reasons that are beyond me. In fact, in Mojave, they made it so that we can't access the screen lock setting without accessing the user's keychain, which I don't understand why they made that change. So if you work for Apple, please come talk to me. And some other issues that we ran into were that we were using OS Query in a sort of non-standard way. OS Query is designed to run as a service on your machine and run checks in a scheduled manner and shove off batch updates to some server somewhere. And we were actually trying to use it for low latency queries at the time of access. And that's not what it was designed for, and so the two systems didn't work too well together. We also ran into some interesting sort of organizational issues. I talked to one person within Netflix who had this perception of Stethoscope as spyware. And this is sort of mind-boggling to me because this person actually had Jamf installed in their system, which meant we had full control of their system and all of their data. And they either didn't realize or had forgotten or whatever. But it's interesting that as we were moving towards increased transparency and actually being very careful about what information we're gathering and explicitly telling people that, hey, we're gathering this information and only this information, we actually had this weird backlash of, because we're being more transparent about this, people are more aware of it and more upset about it. And then we have a contingent of people within Netflix who don't actually care and just want someone to do the security thing for them and take care of it and not have to worry about it, which to an extent I understand. And so within Netflix, we pushed these people to using Chromebooks where they have a totally managed environment that they can't really screw up. And lastly, there was one challenge that was somewhere between technical and organizational, is that we actually have someone who was using FreeBSD as their desktop at Netflix. So we had that question come up of, hey, when are you going to support FreeBSD? Yeah. So in terms of how we rolled this out at Netflix, most internal resources at Netflix are web-based, and we have thousands of internal applications, at least 8,000 internal applications. And so we started by rolling it out as a prompt in front of some of the more sensitive applications, and we sort of went app by app, adding it in front of it. And initially, there was no blocking. It was just a skippable warning. So you could opt out for 24 hours, but if you let Stethoscope do its check and it was successful, then you had a week before it would check again. And this allowed us to gather some data and look a little bit about the progress we were making in terms of changing people's behavior and the configuration of their devices. So that flow looks a little something like this. If you go to an internal Netflix web app, you'll get the standard single sign-on pop-up, and it'll say, hey, run the Stethoscope app, and you can click the button and it'll run, or download and install and then run if you haven't installed it before. And if there's some kind of misconfiguration, you'll get a red screen that says, hey, you should fix this. In this case, the firewall should be enabled. It's not. So once you've actually gone through the steps to fix this, you can tell the site to check again, and it'll say, hey, all right, everything is good, and you continue on to your application. In terms of effectiveness, last update I had was that 90% of employees are seeing Stethoscope sort of on a daily basis at this point. But we're only getting about 50% of people opting in to having Stethoscope scan their machine. These numbers are unfortunately a little consistent because of things like holidays. That seems to have a major effect on how many people are opting in, probably, I'm guessing, because they're not accessing sensitive resources over the holidays, but who knows. And we also did have some technical issues, as I mentioned, with OS Query, and I think that was a problem for a lot of people and sort of, unfortunately, dimmed their enthusiasm for Stethoscope. In terms of future directions, so we are planning to make some changes so that we can have Stethoscope operating on Linux. And we have proofs of concept of what this would look like on iOS and Android, which I think would be really exciting if we could get that rolled out. So if you're interested in playing around with Stethoscope, there's an organization called Ragtag. It's not affiliated with Netflix, but they do have their own signed version of Stethoscope that they distribute for free to whoever wants it. So you can download and play with the app there if you'd like. If you're interested in the source code, it's available on GitHub. This short link will get you there, and I encourage you to go there and play around with it and hop into the Gitter chat and talk with us there if you're interested. With that, I'll take questions.